Hello, and welcome back to Nightfall Lore, where tonight the fog is thick and the streets remember more than they should. Every story in Yharnam eventually leads back to blood. The blood that heals, the blood that corrupts, the blood that dreams. Tonight's story traces all of it back to a single man, the one who first brought that blood up out of the dark and turned it into a religion. Before there was blood, there was a man named Laurence, and before he was a monster wearing a church's robes, he was simply a scholar chasing an answer he could not name. This is the entire lore of Laurence, the First Vicar, told slowly from beginning to end so you can let it carry you the rest of the way into sleep. Laurence began his life in a world that had not yet discovered its own darkness. He was a student at Byrgenwerth, a secluded college perched above a lake that seemed to hold more secrets than water should, studying under a philosopher named Willem, a man obsessed with a single question: what lies beyond human sight? Willem believed ordinary eyes were a kind of prison, and that somewhere beyond the visible world waited truths too vast for the human mind to hold. Laurence was one of his most devoted students. For a time their goals were the same, but a difference in temperament separated them from the start, one that would eventually split two friends into architects of two very different futures. Willem's ambition was cosmic. Laurence's was human. He wanted to save people, not simply to see what could not be seen. It is worth sitting with that difference for a moment, because nearly everything that follows in this story grows out of it. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Whether you're listening from somewhere close to a coastline or somewhere landlocked and far from any body of water at all, let this story carry you the rest of the way towards sleep. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Let your mind drift where it wants to, and let Yharnam's fog settle in around you. He was not a villain from the start. He was a man who wanted fewer people to suffer, and who found, deep beneath a scholarly lake, something that seemed to promise exactly that. Laurence's early life before Byrgenwerth is recorded only in fragments, the kind of half-remembered detail that survives in old letters and the margins of scholarly texts rather than in any formal biography. He came from modest circumstances by most accounts, the kind of background that made him acutely aware of how little separated the comfortable from the suffering in a world without reliable medicine. This awareness followed him into his studies and shaped, more than any single teacher or text, the direction his ambitions would eventually take. What drew him to Byrgenwerth in the first place was simply reputation. It was known, even then, as a place where brilliant and strange minds gathered to pursue questions too dangerous or too obscure for more conventional institutions to entertain. Laurence arrived hungry to understand the world in a way that felt more substantial than anything his earlier education had offered him, and he found in Willem's lectures and in the quiet intensity of the scholars gathered around that lake exactly the kind of intellectual home he had been searching for. The early years of his time there were, by most accounts, genuinely happy ones. He formed close bonds with the other scholars, Willem chief among them, and threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm that bordered on devotion. It is worth remembering this version of Laurence, the eager student rather than the eventual monster, because so much of what follows only makes sense in contrast to who he was before ambition and power began to reshape him. Those who study Byrgenwerth's history closely sometimes point to a single formative memory as the moment that shaped Laurence's later obsession with healing above all else. A plague that swept through his home village during his youth, killing indiscriminately and revealing to him, at a young age, just how little control ordinary people had over their own survival. Whether this specific memory is fact or later embellishment, it captures something true about the emotional undercurrent that ran beneath everything Laurence did throughout his life. He'd seen suffering up close, seen it take people who did not deserve it, and he carried that memory with him into every decision he made afterward, even as those decisions grew more complicated over time. The scholars who studied alongside Laurence in these years often remarked on his distinct talent for translating abstract research into practical application, a skill that would prove essential once he began building the healing church's earliest hospitals. Where other scholars might spend years theorizing about a substance's properties without ever considering its real-world use, Laurence instinctively asked what any given discovery might mean for the people suffering in the villages beyond Byrgenwerth's walls. This instinct, more than any single piece of knowledge he acquired, was perhaps his greatest gift, and it is the very same instinct that eventually built an institution capable of transforming an entire city. The lake beneath Byrgenwerth was not an ordinary lake. Ancient labyrinths coiled beneath its surface, remnants of a civilization the scholars barely understood, filled with creatures that defied any natural classification. It was in these depths that Byrgenwerth's researchers found the thing that would change everything. A strange, pale organism they came to call the Old Blood. The Old Blood was unlike anything recorded in any medical text of the era. It healed wounds that should have been fatal. It slowed the progress of diseases that had no cure. In small quantities, administered carefully, it seemed almost miraculous. For a school built around the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, this was the discovery of a lifetime, and Laurence, more than perhaps anyone else at Byrgenwerth, understood its implications immediately. He saw suffering ended. He saw plagues cured before they could spread. He saw the frail made strong and the dying made whole. Where Willem saw a means to an end, the ascension of humanity's senses beyond ordinary limits, Laurence saw an end in itself. The blood did not need to be a stepping stone towards some greater cosmic revelation. It could simply be medicine. Powerful, transformative medicine. And Laurence believed that medicine belonged to everyone, not locked away in a scholarly vault beneath a remote lake. This period before the founding of the healing church is often glossed over in retellings of Yharnam's history, treated as a brief prologue before the real story begins. But it is essential because it is the only time in the entire chronicle where Laurence's motivations were, by any reasonable measure, good. He was not yet drunk on power. He had not yet built an empire on secrecy and fear. He was a man who had found something extraordinary and wanted to use it to help. The scholars at Byrgenwerth continued their research in these years with a kind of feverish energy. They studied the properties of the old blood, tested its limits, and began to understand that it interacted with the human body in ways that went far beyond simple healing. It seemed to open something, a door, or perhaps a window onto a wider perception of the world. Willem's obsession with eyes and sight found new fuel here. If the blood could heal a wound, perhaps, given enough refinement, it could heal nothing deeper. Perhaps it could grant true sight, the kind Willem had spent his entire life chasing. Laurence watched his mentor's ambitions grow more abstract, more detached from the practical good the blood could do, and something in him began to resist. He didn't resist openly, not yet. He continued to work alongside Willem, continued to contribute to the shared research, but privately his priorities were diverging. He wanted to build something that could reach beyond the walls of Byrgenwerth. He wanted a system, an institution, something capable of distributing the blood's benefits to an entire population rather than hoarding it within a small circle of scholars. It was during this period that Laurence first began to imagine what would eventually become the healing church, though it existed then only as an idea, unformed and unnamed. He pictured hospitals staffed by people trained in the blood's careful use. He pictured a city transformed, its people freed from the plagues and afflictions that had haunted them for generations. He did not yet picture what such an institution would require to sustain itself, the secrecy, the hierarchy, the eventual willingness to sacrifice anyone who threatened its authority. Those realities would come later, layered on gradually, the way compromises always are. Byrgenwerth's golden age was brief, and it ended not with triumph but with rupture. The very thing that had brought Laurence and Willem together, their shared fascination with the lake and its secrets, became the fault line that eventually tore their friendship apart. To appreciate how brief this golden age truly was, it helps to understand the physical world the scholars inhabited. Byrgenwerth stood isolated, reachable only by narrow paths that wound through forest and hillside, a place designed, whether intentionally or not, to keep its work hidden from casual observation. The lake itself sat below the main hall, still and dark, its surface rarely disturbed except by the scholars' own careful expeditions. Locals who lived near the college spoke of it in hushed tones, aware that something unusual occurred there but rarely privy to the specifics. Within this isolated setting, the scholars developed rituals of their own, patterns of work and rest that had little to do with the wider world's rhythms. Laurence often worked through the night, poring over specimens recovered from the lake's depths by lantern light, filling notebook after notebook with observations that would later form the foundation of the church's medical knowledge. Willem, for his part, spent long hours in quiet contemplation, staring out over the water as though trying to will its secrets into visibility through sheer concentration alone. The two men's collaboration during this period produced genuine breakthroughs beyond the discovery of the old blood itself. They developed early techniques for safely extracting and storing the substance, methods for testing its purity, and preliminary theories about why it interacted with the human body in such extraordinary ways. Much of what the healing church would later formalize into official doctrine had its roots in these early, informal experiments conducted by a small group of scholars who had not yet imagined the scale of what they were building toward. It is tempting, in hindsight, to search this period for early warning signs of the catastrophe to come, some subtle indication that the Golden Age was built on unstable foundations from the very start. But such warnings, if they existed at all, were easy to overlook amid the genuine excitement of discovery. The scholars believed with the confidence common among people who have just found something extraordinary, that they were on the verge of solving problems that had plagued humanity for generations. That confidence would carry Laurence forward for decades, long after the reasons for it had grown considerably more complicated. The specific creatures the scholars encountered in the lake's depths during this period deserve some attention, because they hint at the strangeness that would come to define so much of Yharnam's later history. Byrgenwerth's expeditions recovered organisms unlike anything catalogued in conventional natural history, beings that seemed to exist at some uncomfortable intersection between animal and something altogether more alien. Some of these creatures were studied for their potential medical applications. Others were studied simply because their existence demanded explanation, their strangeness serving as a constant reminder that the world contained far more than the scholars' prior education had prepared them to expect. Laurence approached these discoveries with a mixture of fascination and unease that seems, in retrospect, to have foreshadowed the tension that would eventually define his entire career. He was drawn to the wonder of what they were finding, genuinely captivated by the possibility that these strange organisms held answers to questions humanity had never before been equipped to ask. But he also seemed to sense, even in these early years, that some doors were perhaps better left unopened, some questions better left unasked, at least until humanity developed the wisdom to handle whatever answers might lie beyond them. This tension between wonder and caution would define nearly every major decision Laurence made throughout the rest of his life, though the balance between the two shifted considerably as his ambitions grew. In these earliest years at Byrgenwerth, caution still held the upper hand, tempering his enthusiasm for discovery with a genuine concern for the well-being of anyone who might be affected by what the scholars found. It would take years, and the slow accumulation of institutional pressures that came with building and leading his own organisation before that careful balance began to tip decisively toward ambition. The physical labour of these early expeditions should not be understated either. Recovering specimens from the lake's depths required scholars to descend into cold, dark water using equipment that was, by any modern standard, rudimentary and dangerous. Laurence himself participated in a number of these dives during his time at Byrgenwerth, and those who accompanied him described a man who approached even this physically demanding, genuinely risky work with the same methodical care he brought to his later administrative duties. He was by every surviving account not a man who delegated risk easily. If something needed doing, he preferred to understand it firsthand, a trait that would serve the healing church well in its earliest years, even as the institution's later growth made such first-hand involvement increasingly impossible to sustain. The disagreement between Laurence and Willem is often remembered as a single dramatic break, a moment where two men stood on opposite sides of a chasm and never spoke again. The truth was slower and sadder than that. It was a gradual erosion, built from 100 small disagreements about method, purpose and risk, until the two men who'd once shared every idea could no longer share the same room without tensions settling over it like fog. Willem's obsession had, by this point, calcified into something closer to religious devotion. He no longer spoke of the old blood as medicine. He spoke of it as a key, a means of unlocking eyes on the inside, a phrase that would echo through Yharnam's history long after his own fate was sealed. He believed that humanity's greatest failing was its blindness to the true scale of the cosmos, and that the blood offered a path, however dangerous, toward correcting that blindness. Laurence found this pursuit increasingly reckless. He had watched, alongside the other scholars, as experiments with the blood produced results that went beyond healing into something stranger and more disturbing. Test subjects exposed to concentrated or impure forms of the blood did not always improve. Some grew erratic, some grew violent, some seemed to lose whatever made them recognisably human, retreating into states that the scholars could only describe, uneasily, as beast-like. To Willem, these failures were simply the cost of discovery, unfortunate but ultimately acceptable in service of a greater goal. To Laurence, they were warnings, evidence that the blood was not a tool to be wielded carelessly in pursuit of abstract enlightenment, but a resource that demanded caution, structure, and above all, restraint. Where Willem wanted to push further into the unknown regardless of what emerged from it, Laurence wanted to pull back, refine what they already had, and put it to practical use before anyone else was harmed by careless experimentation. There came a point, not marked by any single dramatic confrontation, but by an accumulation of quiet decisions, when Laurence stopped trying to convince Willem and instead began planning around him. He gathered a small circle of like-minded scholars, people who shared his belief that the blood's true value lay in its power to heal rather than its power to reveal. Together they began quietly laying the groundwork for something new, an institution that would take what they had learned at Byrgenwerth and apply it beyond the walls of the school, out into the wider world where ordinary people suffered from wounds and diseases that medicine of the era could not touch. Willem, for his part, seemed almost indifferent to this drift. His attention had turned inward, toward the lake and its labyrinths, toward the pursuit of eyes that could see the truths hidden in the folds of the cosmos. He didn't fight to keep Laurence at Byrgenwerth. He did not attempt to reconcile their diverging paths. In a sense, both men got what they wanted. Willem was left to pursue his obsession without the friction of a former ally who had begun to doubt him, and Laurence was freed to build something of his own, unburdened by Byrgenwerth's insular, secretive culture. But freedom in this case came at a cost neither man fully appreciated at the time. Willem, left to his research without restraint, would eventually pursue his search for eyes to its most catastrophic conclusion, awakening something in the depths of the lake that should have remained undisturbed. And Laurence, freed from Willem's caution about reckless application of the blood, would build an institution that eventually became just as reckless in its own way, only on a civic scale rather than a scholarly one. The rift between them was never fully healed. They would go on to shape the two great forces that defined Yharnam's fate, the healing church above ground and the choir's darker ambitions beneath it, forces that would eventually intertwine in ways neither man could have predicted when they were simply two scholars arguing over the proper use of strange pale blood. There is a version of this story, told sometimes among those who study Yharnam's history most closely, that frames the rift between Laurence and Willem not as a moral disagreement at all, but as a simple divergence of temperament dressed up in philosophical language. Willem was a man who found comfort in mystery, who preferred questions to answers because questions preserved the possibility of wonder. Laurence, by contrast, found mystery uncomfortable. He wanted resolution. He wanted the strange pale substance they had found to mean something concrete and useful, not simply to remain an object of endless fascinated study. This difference in temperament shaped how each man responded to the unsettling results their experiments sometimes produced. When a test subject reacted badly to the blood, growing erratic or violent, Willem tended to treat the outcome with clinical curiosity, another data point in an ongoing inquiry into the blood's true nature. Laurence, by contrast, reacted with something closer to guilt. He had, after all, been the one most insistent that the blood should be put to practical use as quickly as possible, and each failure felt to him like a personal failure of judgment, rather than simply an interesting result. This guilt, more than any single philosophical disagreement, may explain the urgency with which Laurence eventually broke away to found his own institution. He wanted, perhaps more than anything else, a chance to prove that the blood could be used responsibly, that the failures he had witnessed at Byrgenwerth were the result of Willem's reckless methods, rather than any inherent flaw in the substance itself. It was, in its own way, an act of both ambition and atonement, a young man trying to redeem a discovery he feared his mentor was mishandling. Willem, for his part, seems to have registered Laurence's departure with something closer to indifference than heartbreak, at least according to the fragmentary accounts that survive. He had already begun turning his full attention toward the labyrinths beneath the lake, toward questions of eyes and perception that had little room left for institutional ambitions of the kind Laurence was pursuing. The two men, in effect, simply stopped needing each other, each having found a separate obsession substantial enough to fill the space their friendship had once occupied. There is a poignant detail preserved in some of the surviving correspondence between the two men during this transitional period, letters exchanged in the months immediately following Laurence's departure, that suggest neither man fully anticipated how permanent their separation would become. Early letters retain a warmth and collegiality that later correspondence, sparse and increasingly formal, gradually loses. It is possible to trace, across these fragments, the slow cooling of a friendship that neither man seems to have actively chosen to end, but which nonetheless drifted apart under the accumulated weight of diverging priorities and diminishing contact. Some of Byrgenwerth's other scholars found themselves caught between the two men during this period, forced to choose whether explicitly or simply through practical necessity, which vision of the future they wished to pursue. Most who valued the tangible, immediate good of medical application followed Laurence into his new venture. Those who remained drawn to Willem's more abstract pursuit of cosmic understanding stayed behind at Byrgenwerth, continuing the increasingly isolated research that would eventually lead to consequences even more catastrophic than anything the healing church would produce. This division of scholars, this quiet splitting of Byrgenwerth's once unified community into two separate lineages of ambition, represents one of the more underappreciated turning points in Yharnam's broader history. Had the community remained unified, had Laurence and Willem found some way to reconcile their differing priorities, rather than pursuing them in near total isolation from one another, it is possible, though of course impossible to prove, that some of the worst excesses each pursued independently might have been tempered by the other's caution. Instead, both men were left free to follow their respective obsessions to their most extreme conclusions, unchecked by the very friendship that had once provided a natural counterbalance to each other's blind spots. When Laurence left Byrgenwerth, he did not leave empty-handed. He carried with him a working understanding of the old blood, a small circle of devoted followers, and a vision clear enough to build a city around. What he founded became known as the Healing Church, and in its earliest years it was exactly what its name promised, an institution devoted to healing. The church's first hospitals were modest structures, staffed by people trained under Laurence's careful supervision in the proper handling and administration of the blood. Word spread quickly. In a world where medicine was often little more than guesswork and prayer, the Healing Church offered something that actually worked. Wounds closed faster. Fevers broke sooner. Diseases that had once been death sentences became survivable, even curable under the church's care. Yharnam, the city that would eventually grow up around the church's influence, did not yet exist in the form it would later take. It was a smaller settlement then, unremarkable in most respects, distinguished only by its proximity to the strange lake beneath Byrgenwerth. As the Healing Church's reputation grew, so did the city around it. People came from surrounding regions seeking treatment they could not find elsewhere. Some stayed. Businesses grew to support the influx of visitors. Slowly, deliberately, Yharnam transformed from a quiet settlement into a city defined almost entirely by its relationship to blood and healing. Laurence stood at the centre of this transformation, and in these years he seemed to genuinely believe he was building something good. He was not wrong exactly. The blood did heal people. The church's early practices, careful and measured, produced real results without the catastrophic side effects that had plagued Willem's more reckless experiments. For a time, it looked as though Laurence had found the balance Willem never could, harnessing the old blood's power without unleashing its dangers. But institutions, once founded, develop their own momentum, and the Healing Church was no exception. What began as a handful of hospitals staffed by careful practitioners grew into something far larger and more complex. As demand for the blood's healing properties increased, so did the pressure to produce more of it, faster, at greater scale. The careful, patient methods that had defined the church's early success became harder to maintain as the institution grew. Laurence, to his credit, understood the risk of this growth better than most. He insisted on rigorous training for anyone who would administer the blood. He established hierarchies of knowledge, ensuring that only the most trusted and educated members of the church had access to its more dangerous secrets. This was not, initially, an attempt to hoard power. It was in Laurence's mind a safety measure. a way of preventing the kind of reckless misuse that had produced Byrgenwerth's more disturbing failures. But safety measures, maintained long enough and layered thick enough, become something else entirely. The hierarchy Laurence built to protect people from misusing the blood gradually became a hierarchy that protected the Church's own secrets from the people it claimed to serve. Knowledge that had once been restricted for safety became restricted for control. The line between the two, thin to begin with, eventually disappeared altogether. It would be years before this transformation became fully visible, and by the time it did, Laurence himself had changed so gradually that he may not have recognized how far he had drifted. From the man who once wanted nothing more than to heal the sick, with what Byrgenwerth had found beneath its lake. The physical growth of the Church during these years deserves its own attention, because it illustrates just how quickly Laurence's modest vision outgrew his original expectations. What began as a single hospital staffed by a handful of trusted colleagues from Byrgenwerth expanded within a few short years into a network of clinics spread across the settlement that would eventually become Yharnam proper. Each new clinic required trained staff, and training staff required formalized teaching, and formalized teaching required texts, examinations and standards, until the Church found itself, almost without anyone deciding it deliberately, building an entire educational apparatus around the practice of blood ministration. Laurence oversaw much of this expansion personally in the earliest years, travelling between clinics, reviewing the work of newly trained practitioners, and correcting errors before they could cause serious harm. Those who worked alongside him during this period often described him as meticulous to the point of exhaustion, a man who seemed to believe that any lapse in his personal oversight might result in a preventable tragedy. This meticulousness, whatever else it says about his character, reflects a genuine and sustained commitment to doing right by the people his church served, at least in these formative years before the institution grew too large for any single person to oversee directly. As the church's reputation spread beyond Yharnam's immediate vicinity, it began attracting not just patients, but ambitious young scholars eager to study under the man who had discovered how to harness Byrgenwerth's strange find for practical good. Laurence, flattered by this attention and genuinely hopeful about the church's potential to do good on an ever larger scale, welcomed many of these newcomers into his growing institution. Some of them would go on to become among the most important figures in the church's later history, their names eventually as woven into Yharnam's story as Laurence's own. It was also during this period that the church began developing the formal titles and hierarchies that would define its structure for generations to come. Laurence himself took the title of vicar, a term borrowed from older religious traditions but repurposed to describe the church's distinctive blend of medical and spiritual authority. He would eventually become known throughout Yharnam simply as the First Vicar, a title that acknowledged both his founding role and the reverence with which the growing institution regarded him. It is a title that would follow him even after his transformation, even after the man behind it had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The relationships Laurence built with other early clergy during this period shaped the character of the church for generations to come. He favoured practicality over dogma in his selection of trusted advisors, choosing individuals whose skill in the actual practice of healing outweighed any interest in theoretical or theological refinement. This preference gave the early church a distinctly pragmatic character, a culture that valued measurable results over abstract philosophical debate, at least in these formative years before the choir's more esoteric ambitions began to reshape the institution's deeper priorities. Among those Laurence trusted most during this period were individuals who would go on to establish their own significant legacies within the church's history, healers and administrators whose names appear throughout the surviving records of Yharnam's medical and religious development. Their collective work, under Laurence's guidance, established standards of practice that would remain largely intact, even as the church grew far beyond anything they could have imagined during these early years of careful, hands-on institution building. It is worth noting too how Laurence's growing public prominence during this period began to change how he was perceived, both by his followers and gradually by himself. Patients who had been healed under his direct care spoke of him with a gratitude that bordered on reverence, describing him in terms usually reserved for miracle workers rather than trained physicians. This adoration, however understandable given the genuine good the church accomplished, carried its own subtle danger, feeding a growing sense within Laurence that his own vision for how the old blood should be used and understood deserved a trust that perhaps should have remained more carefully questioned even by those closest to him. The daily rhythms of Laurence's life during these years offer a useful window into how an ordinary man gradually became the centre of an extraordinary institution. Mornings were typically spent reviewing reports from the church's growing network of clinics, correspondence detailing patient outcomes, supply needs, and the training progress of newly recruited clergy. Afternoons often involved direct consultation with patients whose cases had proven especially difficult, Laurence lending his own considerable expertise to problems his subordinates had struggled to resolve. Evenings, increasingly, were given over to the quieter, more contemplative work that would eventually feed into the choirs, formation, private study of the stranger properties the blood continued to reveal. This schedule, demanding as it was, seemed to suit Laurence's temperament well during these years. Those who worked closely with him describe a man who found genuine satisfaction in the sheer volume of good his institution accomplished, who could point to specific patients, specific families, specific villages that had been transformed by access to the church's care. It is this concrete, measurable good that makes the later chapters of his story so difficult to reconcile with the man he had been during this period of steady, patient institution building. The same hands that had personally treated countless grateful patients would, within his own lifetime, guide an institution towards secrets and experiments that would eventually help doom the very city those hands had once worked so hard to heal. As the healing church grew, so did its understanding of what the old blood could actually do. What had begun as a simple healing agent revealed itself, under the church's continued study, to be something far stranger and more powerful than anyone at Byrgenwerth had initially grasped. This deeper understanding gave rise to a formal practice the church would eventually call blood ministration, the ritualized transfusion of old blood into human patients as both treatment and increasingly transformation. Blood ministration began simply enough. A patient with a wound or illness would receive a carefully measured transfusion, monitored closely by trained clergy, and in most cases they would recover. But the church's scholars, never content to leave a mystery unexplored, began to notice something else happening in patients who received the blood repeatedly over time. Their bodies changed, subtly at first, then more noticeably. Some patients reported enhanced vitality that lingered long after their original ailment had healed. Others described strange dreams, vivid and recurring, that seemed to draw them towards something just beyond the edge of ordinary perception. For Laurence, these side effects were not immediately alarming. If anything, they seemed to validate everything he had believed since his days at Byrgenwerth. That the old blood was not merely medicine, but a doorway to something greater, something that could elevate humanity beyond its current limitations. Where Willem had sought this elevation through obsessive study of the labyrinths beneath the lake, Laurence began to wonder if the blood itself, administered widely enough and refined carefully enough, could achieve the same end through gentler, more controlled means. This is the point in Laurence's story where the line between healer and something more ambiguous begins to blur. He did not abandon his original goal of easing suffering, but he began layering a new ambition on top of it, one that echoed the very cosmic aspirations he had once rejected in his mentor. If the blood could heal the body, perhaps it could also heal something deeper within the human condition itself. Perhaps it could grant insight, understanding, even a kind of transcendence, without requiring the reckless experimentation Willem had pursued. The Church's research into blood ministration deepened accordingly. Trials expanded beyond simple healing into more ambitious territory, testing how the blood might be refined, concentrated or combined with other substances to produce specific effects. Some of these experiments produced remarkable results, healing that verged on miraculous. Others produced the same disturbing failures that had haunted Byrgenwerth, patients whose minds fractured under the strain of too much blood too quickly, whose bodies began to change in ways that no longer resembled anything human. Laurence, now the undisputed leader of a rapidly growing institution, faced a choice that would define the rest of his life and the fate of the city he had built. He could slow down, return to the cautious, incremental approach that had defined the Church's early success, accepting a smaller scope of ambition in exchange for greater safety. Or he could push forward, treating the failures as an acceptable cost on the path toward a breakthrough he was certain lay just beyond reach. He chose to push forward. It is difficult, looking back, to know exactly what tipped that decision. Perhaps it was pride, the accumulated confidence of a man who had built something extraordinary from nothing and believed he could overcome any obstacle in his path. Perhaps it was something closer to obsession, the same hunger for deeper truth that had once consumed Willem, now taking root in the man who had once positioned himself as Willem's moral opposite. Whatever the cause, the decision set the healing church on a trajectory that would eventually consume the entire city it had been built to heal. The formal practice of blood ministration developed its own culture within the church during this period, complete with rituals and rites that transformed a medical procedure into something closer to a sacrament. Patients receiving transfusions were guided through prayers written specifically for the occasion, prayers that framed the old blood not merely as medicine but as a gift, a communion between the recipient and something vast and benevolent that the Church had discovered on their behalf. This framing served a practical purpose, easing patients' fears about an unfamiliar and sometimes frightening procedure, but it also, gradually, reshaped how the Church itself understood what it was doing. Clergy trained in blood ministration underwent lengthy apprenticeships, learning not just the technical aspects of transfusion, but the accompanying rituals, prayers, and philosophical framework that the Church had built around the practice. This training created a distinct clerical class within the growing institution, individuals whose authority derived not from birth or wealth, but from their mastery of a genuinely difficult and specialized body of knowledge. For many, joining the Church's clergy represented a path toward respect and purpose that would have been unavailable to them in any other context, and this created deep loyalty toward Laurence and the institution he had built. The side effects that began emerging from repeated blood ministration, the strange dreams, the enhanced vitality, the subtle physical changes, were documented meticulously by the Church's scholars, who treated each case with the same careful curiosity that had once characterized their work at Byrgenwerth. Detailed records were kept of every patient's response, cross-referenced against the concentration and purity of the blood administered, in an effort to understand exactly what conditions produced which effects. This record-keeping, thorough, and genuinely scientific in its early execution, would later prove invaluable and troubling, as the choir's more secretive research built directly upon this accumulated public data. Laurence's decision to pursue deeper understanding of these side effects, rather than simply treating them as anomalies to be minimized, reflects once again the tension at the heart of his character. He could have chosen caution, restricting blood ministration to its proven medical applications and discouraging further experimentation into its stranger properties. Instead, he chose curiosity, a choice that honoured the scholarly instincts he'd carried with him from Byrgenwerth, even as it planted the seeds for everything that would eventually go wrong. The church's clinics during this period began to specialise in different aspects of blood ministration, some focusing purely on treating physical ailments through conservative, well-tested applications of the old blood, while others, gradually and with far less public visibility, began exploring the substance's more unusual properties under closer, more controlled conditions. This specialisation allowed the church to maintain its public reputation for safe, reliable healing, even as a smaller subset of its practitioners pushed the boundaries of what the blood could do in directions the general public never learned about. Patients who volunteered, or in some documented cases were persuaded, to participate in these more experimental applications of blood ministration occupied an uneasy position within the church's growing hierarchy. They were treated with genuine care by the standards of the era, monitored closely, and given access to resources and attention that ordinary patients rarely received. But they were also, in a very real sense, subjects of ongoing experimentation, whose full understanding of the risks involved remained limited by the church's own careful control over what information reached them. Laurence, who had once insisted so strongly on transparency and practical benefit as the guiding principles of his institution, seems to have gradually accepted this more ambiguous relationship between patient and experimental subject as simply a necessary cost of continued progress. It is worth pausing to consider how gradual and reasonable each individual step in this process must have felt to those making the decisions at the time. No single choice, viewed in isolation, appears monstrous. Expanding research to better understand a promising discovery is, in the abstract, simply good scientific practice. It is only an aggregate, viewed across the full span of decades that this chapter of the Church's history covers, that the pattern becomes visible. A slow, almost imperceptible drift from careful, consensual healing towards something considerably more troubling, each step justified by the one before it, until the destination bore almost no resemblance to where the journey had begun. As the Healing Church's ambitions expanded, so did its physical presence within the city. What had once been a scattered collection of hospitals coalesced into something far grander, an architectural statement of the Church's growing power. This transformation gave rise to what would eventually be known as Central Yharnam, the beating heart of the city, dominated by cathedrals, clinics, and church-controlled districts that made the institution's influence impossible to ignore. The architecture of this era reflected Laurence's dual nature perfectly, the healer and the visionary existing in uneasy tension within the same buildings. The hospitals were genuinely functional, staffed by trained clergy capable of administering real medical care to a population that desperately needed it. But layered atop this practical function was an increasingly ornate religious aesthetic, all soaring arches and elaborate stained glass, designed to inspire awe and, not incidentally, obedience. This was the era in which the Healing Church began to resemble a religion in the fullest sense, not merely an institution that happened to use the language of faith, but a genuine belief system with its own doctrine, its own hierarchy of clergy, and its own increasingly elaborate rituals surrounding the administration of blood. Laurence, whether by design or by the slow accumulation of circumstance, had positioned himself at the centre of this belief system as something close to a prophet. He was the man who had discovered the truth of the old blood's power and brought it down from Byrgenwerth's secretive halls into the light of public benefit. The people of Yharnam, for their part, had every reason to embrace this new faith. The church's medicine worked, often spectacularly so, in a world where alternatives were scarce and unreliable. Trust in the church grew not from blind devotion but from lived experience, from wounds that healed and diseases that receded under its care. This trust became the foundation upon which the church built an authority that would eventually extend far beyond medicine into nearly every aspect of civic life. It was during this period that the church began establishing more formal structures of governance within the city, structures that blurred the line between religious authority and political control. Clergy trained in blood ministration were not merely healers, but increasingly figures of civic importance, consulted on matters far beyond medicine. The church's hospitals became centres of community life. Its cathedrals became landmarks that defined the city's skyline and symbolically its priorities. Laurence moved through this expanding institution with the confidence of a man who believed sincerely that he was still serving the same goal that had first driven him away from Byrgenwerth, the alleviation of human suffering. But the scale of what he had built now dwarfed anything he could have imagined as a young scholar arguing with Willem over the proper use of strange blood. An institution of this size required resources, secrecy and control in quantities that inevitably reshaped its founder's priorities, whether he recognised the shift or not. Central Yharnam, with all its grandeur and genuine medical achievement, was also the visible surface of something far more hidden. Beneath the cathedrals and hospitals, in chambers not open to the general public, the church's most trusted scholars continued the deeper research that had begun with blood ministration. What they found in those hidden chambers would eventually give rise to an inner circle so secretive that even most of the church's own clergy would remain unaware of its existence. Walk through central Yharnam even in its later, more troubled years, and the ambition embedded in its architecture is impossible to miss. Towering cathedrals rise above narrow, winding streets, their spires visible from nearly every corner of the city, a constant reminder of the institution's presence and authority. Clinics dot the district at regular intervals, easily identifiable by the same architectural language as the grander cathedrals, ensuring that even the church's most practical, functional buildings carried an air of sanctified purpose. The people who lived and worked in central Yharnam during this period of expansion experienced the church's growing influence in ways both grand and mundane. Civic decisions that might once have fallen to secular authorities increasingly involved consultation with church leadership. Disputes between neighbours sometimes found their way to clerical mediation rather than any secular court. Even the rhythms of daily life, market hours, festival dates, the calendar itself, began to align with the church's own liturgical schedule, a schedule built around the rituals of blood ministration and the feast days Laurence had established to commemorate the church's founding and its early triumphs over disease. This deepening entanglement between civic and religious authority did not happen through any single dramatic seizure of power. It accumulated gradually, decision by decision, each one reasonable in isolation, until the people of Yharnam found themselves living in a city where the healing church's authority touched nearly every aspect of daily existence. Laurence, watching this consolidation of influence from the centre of the institution he had built, seems to have regarded it as simply the natural consequence of doing good work well. He rarely, if ever, paused to consider what such concentrated authority might eventually enable should the institution's priorities ever shift away from the compassionate mission that justified its power in the first place. The hidden chambers beneath the cathedrals, where the choir would eventually conduct its most secretive research, existed even in these early years of central Yharnam's construction, though their purpose had not yet crystallized into anything as ambitious as what would follow. They began, in truth, as simple storage and archive spaces, places to keep the church's growing collection of research notes, specimens and artifacts recovered from Byrgenwerth's original expeditions. It was only gradually, as the choir formed and its ambitions expanded, that these modest archive rooms transformed into the secretive laboratories that would eventually house some of Yharnam's darkest secrets. Central Yharnam's transformation also brought with it a shift in the character of the city's population, as word of the church's healing power spread far beyond the region's original borders. Pilgrims arrived from distant villages, some travelling for weeks in hope of receiving treatment unavailable anywhere else. This influx reshaped the city's economy and culture in ways that extended well beyond the church's direct medical practice. Inns and lodging houses sprang up to accommodate visiting pilgrims. Markets grew to supply the needs of a population that had, within a generation or two, multiplied many times over its original size. Laurence, watching this transformation unfold, seems to have taken genuine pride in what his institution had accomplished for the city. Contemporary accounts describe him walking the streets of central Yharnam personally in these years, greeting patients who had travelled great distances for care, listening to their stories with what those who witnessed it described as sincere attentiveness. This was not, by most accounts, a man performing benevolence for public consumption. It was a man who genuinely seemed to find meaning in the direct, human impact of the institution he had built, even as that same institution was beginning to develop the hidden dimensions that would eventually consume it. It is worth pausing here to imagine what it might have felt like to be an ordinary resident of Yharnam during this period, watching your city transform around you into something grander and more prosperous than anything your parents or grandparents could have imagined, all because of a scholar who had once left a remote lakeside college to bring a miraculous medicine into the world. There would have been genuine gratitude in that experience, genuine hope, a sense that the future held more promise than the past ever had, that this hope would eventually curdle into horror, that the very institution responsible for the city's prosperity would also become responsible for its eventual ruin, remained entirely invisible to the people living through these years of expansion and optimism. The church also began, during this period, to formalize its relationship with the emerging noble families of the region, most notably the Cainhurst bloodline, whose own complicated history with the old blood would eventually intersect with the healing church's ambitions in ways neither institution fully anticipated at the outset. Early interactions between Laurence's church and Cainhurst's aristocracy were largely cordial, each recognizing in the other a shared interest in understanding and cultivating the properties of the strange blood that had transformed both institutions' fortunes, albeit through very different methods and traditions. This relationship, cordial in its early years, would eventually curdle into rivalry and outright hostility as both institutions' ambitions expanded and began to compete for influence and resources. But that conflict lay still some distance in the future during central Yharnam's years of confident expansion. Within the growing structure of the healing church, a smaller, far more secretive group began to take shape. This inner circle, composed of the church's most gifted and most trusted scholars, would eventually become known as the choir. Officially, the choir existed to pursue the church's highest research, the deepest questions surrounding the nature and origin of the old blood. Unofficially, it became the vessel for an ambition that echoed Willem's original obsession, far more closely than Laurence's public mission of healing ever did. Laurence's role in founding the choir is one of the more contested and ambiguous elements of his story. Some accounts suggest he created the choir deliberately, as a controlled space where the church's most dangerous research could be conducted away from public view, ensuring that any risks were contained within a small, trusted circle rather than spreading uncontrolled through the wider institution. Other interpretations suggest the choir emerged more organically, a natural consequence of concentrating the church's most curious and ambitious minds together, where their shared hunger for deeper knowledge inevitably pushed them past the boundaries Laurence had originally intended. Whatever its precise origins, the choir represented a return to the very cosmic ambitions Laurence had once rejected when he left Byrgenwerth. Its members were not content with the blood's proven medical applications. They wanted to understand its true source, its true nature, and its connection to whatever vast, incomprehensible entities lay beyond ordinary human perception. In this sense, the choir was Willem's dream realised within Laurence's institution, a bitter irony that Laurence himself may have been slow to recognise, or perhaps recognised fully and chose not to confront. The choir's research took the church's understanding of the old blood into genuinely disturbing territory. Where public blood ministration focused on healing and controlled enhancement, the choir's private experiments pushed toward communion with something far stranger, entities the scholars came to refer to, in hushed and careful terms, as the Great Ones. These were not gods in any traditional sense, but incomprehensibly vast beings whose true nature defied human understanding, existing somewhere beyond the boundary of ordinary perception that Willem had spent his entire life trying to breach. For Laurence, the existence of the choir created an uncomfortable duality at the heart of everything he had built. Publicly, the healing church remained devoted to its founding mission of healing the sick and easing suffering. Privately, its most trusted inner circle pursued knowledge and communion with entities so far beyond human comprehension that even understanding them risked destroying the mind that attempted it. Laurence, caught between these two identities, seemed to convince himself that both could coexist indefinitely, that the public good the church provided justified whatever secretive research continued in its hidden chambers. This willingness to compartmentalize, to allow one hand to heal while the other reached toward something far darker, defines much of what Laurence became in these years. He was no longer simply a healer with good intentions who had drifted slightly off course. He was the architect of an institution with two faces, one turned toward the public it served, the other turned toward a hunger for cosmic knowledge that had never truly left him, no matter how far he believed he had travelled from Willem's original obsession. The choir would go on to become one of the most significant and dangerous forces in Yharnam's history, its research eventually producing consequences that reshaped the entire city. But in these early years, it remained hidden, a secret within a secret, known only to the small circle of scholars trusted enough to be invited into its ranks, and to Laurence himself, who had allowed his institution to grow a second, darker heart beneath its healing exterior. Membership in the choir was never formally announced or publicised within the wider church. Scholars were invited quietly, usually after demonstrating exceptional talent in their study of blood ministration's more unusual effects, and once invited, they were bound by oaths of secrecy that few, if any, ever broke. This secrecy served a practical purpose beyond simple caution. The choir's research, dealing as it did with entities and concepts that, strained the boundaries of sane comprehension, was considered too dangerous to expose to minds not carefully prepared for it. Even within the Church's own hierarchy, most clergy remained blissfully unaware of just how far their institution's most trusted scholars had ventured beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine. The specific research methods the choir developed during this formative period drew heavily on fragments of knowledge recovered from Byrgenwerth's ancient labyrinths, texts and artifacts that Willem's own research had uncovered but never fully deciphered. The choir scholars, working with resources and institutional support that Willem himself had never possessed, made progress on these fragments that would have seemed impossible during the years Laurence and Willem had studied together. In a sense, the choir succeeded where Willem's solitary pursuit had stalled, not through greater brilliance, but through greater organisation, greater funding, and a willingness to pursue answers with the full institutional weight of the Church behind them. This success came with its own quiet irony that few within the choir seemed willing to acknowledge directly. The very methods and resources that made their research possible existed only because Laurence had built an institution explicitly to move away from Willem's reckless pursuit of forbidden knowledge, and yet here they were, using that same institution's accumulated wealth and authority to pursue an even more ambitious version of exactly what Willem had once sought. It is difficult to know whether Laurence himself ever fully confronted this irony, or whether he simply allowed himself the comfort of believing that his institution's careful, controlled approach made its pursuit of cosmic knowledge fundamentally different and safer than Willem's more solitary and uncontrolled experiments had ever been. The physical spaces the choir occupied within the cathedral ward's growing complex reflected the group's peculiar dual identity, part scholarly research chamber, part sacred sanctuary. Shelves lined with carefully preserved specimens sat alongside altars devoted to increasingly elaborate rituals. Instruments for precise measurement and analysis shared table space with ceremonial vessels used in the choir's private rites. This blending of scientific and spiritual practice, unusual by the standards of any conventional institution, reflected how thoroughly the choir had come to understand its work as something beyond ordinary research, a genuine communion with forces that demanded reverence as much as study. The scholars who rose to leadership within the choir during this period developed reputations within their small and secretive circle that rivaled Laurence's own standing within the wider church. Some of these figures would go on to play significant roles in the events that eventually unfolded across Yharnam's later history, their names surfacing again and again in records connected to the city's darkest chapters. Their early work within the choir, conducted under Laurence's ultimate but increasingly distant authority, established patterns of secretive, ambitious research that would continue long after Laurence himself had ceased to be capable of overseeing it in any meaningful way. It is worth considering too how the choir's very existence changed the character of the healing church as a whole, even for those clergy members who remained entirely unaware of its presence. An institution with a hidden inner circle pursuing goals its outer membership knows nothing about is, by definition, an institution built on a foundation of unequal trust. However carefully that inequality is managed and concealed, the Church's public commitment to compassionate healing existed alongside, and was in practice subordinate to, a private commitment to cosmic understanding that most of its own members never had any opportunity to consent to or even learn about. This structural dishonesty, present from the choir's earliest formation, would prove impossible to sustain indefinitely. As the healing church's influence expanded and its secrets deepened, Laurence recognised the need for a force capable of protecting the institution, enforcing its doctrine and containing the increasingly unpredictable consequences of its research. This need gave rise to the Church's military arm, a body of knights trained not merely in combat but in the specific dangers posed by failed experiments with the old blood. At the head of this order stood a knight named Ludwig, a figure who would become one of the most tragic and consequential characters in the entire history of Yharnam. Ludwig was, by most accounts, everything Laurence could have hoped for in a defender of the Church's mission. He was disciplined, deeply faithful, and utterly devoted to the ideal of protecting the innocent from the dangers that lurked at the edges of the Church's research. Under Laurence's guidance, Ludwig built an order of knights bound by strict codes of conduct, trained to identify and contain the beast-like transformations that occasionally resulted from failed blood ministration, and to do so with as much mercy as the situation allowed. The relationship between Laurence and Ludwig reflected in many ways the same duality that defined the Church itself. Laurence needed Ludwig's order to protect the public face of the Church, to ensure that the occasional catastrophic failures of blood research did not undermine public trust in the institution's healing mission. But this protective function inevitably required the knights to confront the darker consequences of exactly the kind of research the choir was conducting in its hidden chambers, research that Laurence himself had allowed to continue. Ludwig, to his credit, approached this responsibility with genuine moral seriousness. He didn't view the beast-like patients his order sometimes had to contain as monsters to be destroyed without thought. He saw them as victims, people who had suffered under the Church's care rather than being healed by it, and he insisted that his knights treat them with as much compassion as their dangerous condition allowed. This commitment to compassionate containment, rather than simple extermination, set Ludwig's order apart and earned him a reputation as one of the most honourable figures within the Church's growing hierarchy. For a time, this arrangement held. Ludwig's knights contained the failures. The Church's public healing mission continued largely uninterrupted. Laurence could tell himself that the system he had built, however imperfect, was managing its risks responsibly, protecting both the public and the unfortunate victims of failed research with equal care. But the deeper the choir's research pushed, the more frequent and severe these failures became. Ludwig, forced to confront an escalating tide of transformed patients, began to question the institution he had sworn to protect. He could see, more clearly than most within the Church's hierarchy, the gap widening between the Church's public mission of healing and the darker consequences of its private research. This growing doubt would eventually consume Ludwig himself in one of the most tragic transformations in the entire history of the Church, though that fate lay still ahead of him during the years when he served as Laurence's most trusted and honourable knight. Laurence, watching Ludwig's order grow more strained under the weight of the Church's expanding secrets, faced a choice that echoed the one he had faced years earlier at Byrgenwerth. He could slow the pace of research, reduce the risk to patients and knights alike, and accept a smaller, safer institution. Or he could continue pushing forward, trusting that Ludwig's order could contain whatever consequences emerged. Once again, he chose to push forward, and once again, that choice would eventually exact a price far greater than he anticipated. The training Ludwig developed for his knights reflected a genuinely thoughtful approach to an impossible problem. Recruits learned not just swordsmanship and discipline, but the early warning signs of beast-like transformation, the subtle changes in behaviour and physiology that preceded a full episode. This early identification allowed the knights, in many cases, to intervene before a transformation became irreversible, offering afflicted patients treatment rather than simple destruction. It was, by the standards of the era, a remarkably compassionate approach to a problem that many other, institutions might have addressed through fear and violence alone. Ludwig himself became something of a legend within the church during these years, no, not just for his skill in combat, but for his unwavering moral clarity in situations that offered little room for easy answers. Stories circulated among the clergy of knights under his command who had shown mercy to transformed patients at considerable personal risk, following Ludwig's example rather than simply following orders. This culture of compassionate restraint, established under Laurence's guidance and embodied by Ludwig's leadership, represented one of the genuine bright spots within an institution that was, in other respects, drifting steadily toward darker territory. But even this bright spot carried within it the seeds of future tragedy. Ludwig's proximity to the church's failures, his direct, repeated confrontation with the human cost of blood ministration gone wrong, gave him a perspective that few others within the church's hierarchy shared. He saw, more clearly than the scholars safely removed in their research chambers, exactly what the choir's escalating ambitions were costing in human terms. This clarity would eventually curdle into a doubt so profound that Ludwig himself would come to question everything he had once believed about the institution he served, a doubt that foreshadowed his own eventual transformation into one of the most tragic figures in the entirety of Yharnam's later history. The relationship between Laurence and Ludwig deepened over the years into something resembling genuine friendship, unusual for a leader of Laurence's growing stature and a knight whose duties kept him constantly occupied with the church's most dangerous practical work. Laurence, by most accounts, valued Ludwig's counsel precisely because it came unfiltered by the political considerations that increasingly shaped the advice he received from the church's other senior clergy. Ludwig told him what he saw plainly, without softening the harder truths about the human cost of the church's continued research, and Laurence, at least in these years, seemed to genuinely welcome that honesty. This friendship makes the eventual trajectory of Ludwig's own story all the more painful to consider. A man who had spent his career treating the church's failures with compassion, who had built an entire order around the principle that even the most monstrous transformations deserved mercy rather than simple destruction, would himself eventually succumb to the very affliction he had spent his life trying to contain and treat humanely in others. It is one of the bitterest ironies within an already bitter history that the knight most devoted to preserving human dignity in the face of the church's failures would eventually lose that dignity to the same failures himself. Laurence did not live to see the full extent of what would eventually happen to Ludwig, having undergone his own transformation before his most trusted knight's fate fully played out. But the foundations of that eventual tragedy were laid during these years of their shared work, in the accumulated strain of confronting failure after failure, without ever fully addressing the root cause driving those failures forward. Both men, in their own ways, were casualties of an institution that had grown too ambitious to be safely managed by even its most careful and well-intentioned leaders. Despite everything the Healing Church had already accomplished, both publicly through its hospitals and privately through the choir's research, one fundamental question remained unanswered. Where did the old blood actually come from? The scholars at Byrgenwerth had discovered it in the depths of the lake, but its true origin, its ultimate source, remained a mystery even after decades of study. For Laurence, and increasingly for the choir, answering this question became an obsession that eclipsed almost everything else the church pursued. The search for the blood source led the choir's scholars deeper into esoteric research than they had ever attempted before. They began to suspect that the blood was not merely a naturally occurring substance, but something connected to the vast, incomprehensible entities their earlier research had only glimpsed, the beings they called the Great Ones. If the old blood truly originated from a great one, then understanding its source meant understanding and potentially communing with something far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human existence. This period of research pushed the Church's ambitions into genuinely reckless territory. The careful, incremental caution that had once characterized Laurence's approach to the blood's use gave way to something closer to Willem's original obsession, a hunger to breach the boundary of human perception regardless of the cost. Laurence, whether he fully recognized it or not, had become the very thing he once believed he was different from. The choir's research during this period focused increasingly on rituals designed to establish contact, or even a form of communion with whatever entity might lie at the source of the old blood. These rituals drew on fragments of knowledge recovered from Byrgenwerth's ancient labyrinths, combined with the Church's own decades of accumulated understanding of blood ministration. The scholars believed that if they could refine their methods precisely enough, they might achieve what Willem had spent his entire life failing to accomplish: true communion with something beyond the visible world. It was during this period of intensified research that the choir scholars first identified signs pointing toward the ocean, and specifically toward a hidden location beneath its depths, as a potential source of the answers they sought. This discovery would eventually lead the Church's most ambitious researchers toward a place known as the Fishing Hamlet, a hidden village whose connection to the old blood's true origin would prove far darker and more consequential than anything the choir had previously encountered. Laurence, now deeply invested in the search for ultimate answers, authorized increasingly ambitious expeditions and experiments in pursuit of this goal. He justified this escalation, as he had justified every previous escalation, as a necessary step toward a greater good, a final breakthrough that would once and for all secure the Church's ability to heal without limitation. But each step deeper into this research moved him further from the man who had once left Byrgenwerth specifically to escape the reckless pursuit of cosmic truth at any cost. The irony of Laurence's trajectory becomes almost unbearable to consider directly. He had built an entire institution in opposition to Willem's obsessive search for eyes beyond human sight, and yet decades later, he found himself leading that same institution toward an even more ambitious version of exactly the goal he had once rejected. The choir's search for the old blood source was, in every meaningful sense, Willem's dream pursued with greater resources, greater secrecy, and far greater consequences than Willem himself had ever managed to unleash. The choir's research during this era took on an increasingly ritualistic quality, moving beyond conventional experimentation into practices that blurred the line between science and worship. Scholars conducted elaborate ceremonies designed to heighten their receptivity to whatever cosmic signals the old blood might carry, drawing on techniques adapted from older religious traditions and combined with the Church's own accumulated understanding of blood ministration's stranger effects. These ceremonies, conducted in the deepest and most secure chambers beneath the cathedral ward, represented the fullest expression yet of the Church's transformation from medical institution into something approaching a cosmic cult, operating beneath a healer's disguise. Individual scholars within the choir began reporting experiences during these ceremonies that defied easy explanation, visions of vast indistinct forms glimpsed at the edge of perception, sensations of being observed by something far beyond the physical chamber they occupied. Whether these experiences reflected genuine contact with something beyond ordinary reality, or simply the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to concentrated old blood combined with the intense expectation these scholars brought to their work, remains a question the surviving records cannot definitively answer. What is certain is that these reported experiences fueled the choir's conviction that they were drawing closer to genuine communion with the entities they sought, closer than Willem's own solitary research had ever managed to achieve. Laurence's role during this intensifying period of research grew increasingly administrative rather than directly experimental. As the church's overall leader, his time was consumed by the practical demands of overseeing a sprawling institution, leaving much of the choir's day-to-day research to its most senior members. This delegation, reasonable on its face given the sheer scale of what Laurence now oversaw, also meant that his direct oversight of the choir's most dangerous work grew thinner over time, even as that work grew more consequential. It is one of the persistent tragedies of Laurence's story that the very success of the institution he built eventually made it too large for him to fully understand or control. Some of the choir's most senior scholars during this period began developing theories about the precise nature of the entities they hoped to contact, theories that drew on fragments of older, pre-Byrgenwerth knowledge recovered from ruins scattered throughout the region surrounding Yharnam. These fragments suggested that humanity's encounters with such entities were not in fact unprecedented, that other civilizations, in eras long predating Byrgenwerth's own founding, may have achieved forms of contact or communion that had since been lost to time, their knowledge scattered and forgotten across ruins that only careful, patient archaeological work could hope to reassemble. This discovery reframed the choir's entire project in the minds of its most dedicated scholars. They were not, they began to believe, pioneering something entirely new, but rather rediscovering and refining a form of knowledge that had once been more widely understood before whatever catastrophe had scattered it into fragments across ruins and half-remembered legends. This reframing carried a distinct emotional weight for scholars already inclined toward obsessive dedication, transforming their work from mere research into something closer to a sacred restoration project, an effort to reclaim wisdom that rightfully belonged to humanity but had been tragically lost. Laurence's own relationship to this reframing remains difficult to characterize with certainty. Some records suggest he embraced this narrative wholeheartedly, finding in it a justification for the choir's increasingly ambitious research that aligned comfortably with his lifelong belief that knowledge, properly applied, served humanity's genuine well-being. Other interpretations suggest a more complicated relationship, a founder who recognized the seductive danger in a narrative that framed reckless ambition as sacred restoration, but who found himself, by this point in his career, too invested in the institution's continued momentum to meaningfully challenge the direction his own scholars had chosen to pursue. The choir's search for the old blood's true source eventually led its most trusted researchers to a discovery that would reshape the entire trajectory of the healing church's hidden ambitions. A secluded coastal village known as the fishing hamlet, home to a small community that had, generations earlier, encountered something the rest of Yharnam could barely comprehend. The village's inhabitants had long ago come into contact with an entity of immense and ancient power, a being connected directly to the source of the old blood itself. Through this contact, the villagers had undergone their own strange transformation, developing a unique relationship with the blood that predated even Byrgenwerth's discovery of it. For the choir, the fishing hamlet represented something extraordinary, a living connection to the very source they had spent years searching for, hidden away in isolation from the rest of the world. The church's approach to this discovery revealed, perhaps more clearly than anything before it, how far Laurence's institution had drifted from its founding principles of consent and careful, controlled healing. Rather than approaching the fishing hamlet's inhabitants as partners in a shared pursuit of knowledge, the church's researchers treated the village and its unique connection to the old blood as a resource to be studied and, in the end, extracted. This approach led to consequences the choir had not fully anticipated, consequences that would echo through the rest of the church's history. Among the results of this contact and study was a growing understanding of just how vast and strange the entities connected to the old blood truly were. The being at the heart of the fishing hamlet's transformation was not simply a source of powerful blood, but a genuine cosmic entity, one whose presence and influence extended far beyond what the choir's scholars had previously imagined possible. Contact with this entity and study of its bloodline deepened the church's understanding of the Great Ones considerably, but it also deepened the risks associated with that understanding. The fishing hamlet's fate, and the fate of its inhabitants, became inextricably tied to the church's continued ambitions in the years that followed. What had once been a hidden, self-contained community became, through the choir's involvement, another thread in the increasingly tangled web of secrets that defined the healing church's private pursuits. The moral cost of this involvement, the harm done to a community that had asked for none of the church's attention, sat uneasily alongside the institution's continued public claims of benevolent healing. Laurence's direct involvement in the events at the fishing hamlet remains one of the more debated aspects of his history. Some accounts suggest he authorised the choir's approach personally, viewing the village's unique connection to the old blood as too significant an opportunity to leave unexplored, regardless of the ethical concerns involved. Others suggest that by this point in the church's development, the choir had grown powerful and autonomous enough to pursue such research with only nominal oversight from Laurence himself, a troubling possibility given his position as the church's ultimate authority. Whatever the precise nature of his involvement, the events at the fishing hamlet represent a clear turning point in the moral trajectory of the institution Laurence had built. The healing church that had once positioned itself as a force for compassionate, consensual healing had become, by this point, an institution willing to exploit vulnerable communities in pursuit of cosmic knowledge, a transformation as complete and as tragic as anything that had happened to the individual patients, whose bodies had been twisted by failed blood ministration over the years. The fishing hamlet itself, isolated along a stretch of coastline rarely visited by outsiders, had developed its own insular culture over generations of contact with the entity that shaped its people. The villagers there had adapted in their own way to an existence intertwined with the old blood far more directly and completely than anything the people of Yharnam had experienced. Their bodies, their traditions, even their understanding of the world around them had been shaped by proximity to something the choir's scholars could only begin to comprehend after years of dedicated study. When the church's researchers first made contact with this hidden village, they encountered a community that regarded outsiders with deep suspicion, a suspicion that would prove entirely justified given how events eventually unfolded. Early expeditions returned with only fragmentary information, unable to fully penetrate the village's guarded traditions. It took repeated visits and increasingly invasive methods of study before the choir's scholars began to grasp the true scale of what the fishing hamlet represented, and by then the damage done to the trust between the village and the wider world had already become irreparable. The moral weight of what occurred at the fishing hamlet extends beyond any single decision Laurence may or may not have personally authorised. It reflects instead the cumulative logic of an institution that had spent decades prioritising knowledge acquisition over the well-being of those who stood between the church and its answers. This was not a sudden betrayal of founding principles so much as the natural endpoint of choices made gradually, one justified compromise after another, until an institution founded to heal had become willing to sacrifice an entire community's autonomy and safety in pursuit of understanding it believed would someday benefit everyone. It rarely occurred to anyone within the choir to ask the fishing hamlet's own people what they believed the cost of that pursuit should be. Among the discoveries made through continued study of the fishing hamlet's inhabitants was a deeper understanding of how the old blood could interact with the human body when exposure occurred across many generations rather than through a single course of treatment. The villagers' bodies had adapted in ways that went far beyond anything the church's own patients had ever exhibited, developments that hinted at possibilities the choir's scholars found simultaneously thrilling and deeply unsettling. If exposure across generations could produce such profound transformation, what might be possible if the church applied similar principles more deliberately, more systematically across its own patient population? This line of thinking, dangerous in its implications, represents one of the clearest points at which the choir's research shifted from studying transformation to actively courting it. Where earlier generations of church scholars had treated transformation as an unfortunate side effect to be minimised and contained, the choir's deepening fascination with the fishing hamlet's inhabitants introduced the unsettling possibility that transformation itself, properly understood and controlled, might represent the true path toward the transcendence Laurence's institution had always secretly pursued beneath its public mission. It is difficult to overstate how significant this shift in thinking would prove for everything that followed, including Laurence's own eventual fate. The ritual that would eventually transform him from man into beast drew directly on principles first observed and documented through the choir's extended study of the fishing hamlet, making the village's exploitation not simply an isolated moral failure, but a direct causal link in the chain of events that would eventually consume the church's own founder. Every account of Laurence's fate converges eventually on a single event: the ritual that transformed him from the founder and leader of the healing church into something no longer recognisable as human. The details of this transformation remain shrouded in the same secrecy that defines so much of the choir's deepest research, but its broad outline can be pieced together from what remained afterward, and from the consequences that echoed through Yharnam long after Laurence himself had ceased to exist in any conventional sense. By this point in the church's history, Laurence's ambitions had grown to encompass nearly everything Willem had once pursued at Byrgenwerth, and more besides. He no longer sought merely to heal the sick or even to understand the old blood's cosmic origins. He sought in the final analysis to become something greater than human himself, to achieve the kind of transcendence that Willem's research had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Whether this ambition emerged gradually, the natural culmination of decades of escalating research, or whether it represented a deliberate final choice made with full awareness of its consequences, remains one of the great unanswered questions of Laurence's story. What is known is that Laurence underwent a ritual involving deeply concentrated old blood, likely refined using knowledge drawn from the choir's research into the fishing hamlet and its cosmic connections. This ritual, intended to grant Laurence a form of transcendent perception or power beyond ordinary human limitation, instead transformed his body into something monstrous, a beast far larger and more terrible than any of the failed patients his own church had once struggled to contain. The tragic irony of this transformation is difficult to overstate. Laurence had spent his entire career positioning himself against the reckless pursuit of forbidden knowledge, defining his mission in explicit opposition to the risks Willem had been willing to take, and yet, in the end, he became a victim of the exact same hunger, consumed by the very transformation his church had spent decades trying to prevent and contain in others. The healer became the beast. The founder of an institution built to save people from suffering became, in his final act, a source of horror that the city he had built would eventually have to confront and destroy. What remained of Laurence after this transformation was not simply erased from the world. His skull, retained by the church even after his transformation, became an object of profound significance, eventually placed within the care of one of the church's most devoted clergy members, as part of a ritual meant to invoke Laurence's presence and power once more. This later ritual, and the figure who carried it out, would go on to become one of the most consequential events in the final days of Yharnam's story, a direct echo of the transformation that had claimed Laurence himself. The choir and the wider healing church treated Laurence's transformation and continued existence as a beast with a strange reverence rather than horror. To them, he had not been destroyed by his ambitions, but rather elevated by them, transformed into something that, however monstrous by human standards, represented a genuine step toward the transcendence the Church had always secretly pursued beneath its public mission of healing. This reverence, more than anything else, reveals how completely the institution Laurence founded had drifted from its original purpose by the time its founder met his terrible end. The circumstances surrounding the ritual itself remain difficult to reconstruct with any real certainty, and much of what is understood today comes from careful inference rather than direct testimony, since none of those who witnessed the transformation firsthand left behind any account clear enough to fully trust. What can be pieced together suggests a ceremony conducted in the deepest chambers beneath the cathedral ward, attended only by the choir's most senior members, drawing on refined blood derived at least in part from the knowledge gained through the fishing Hamlet's cosmic connections. Whether Laurence approached this ritual with confidence, or with the private doubt of a man who suspected, even as he committed to the act, that he might be repeating Willem's own mistakes on a grander scale, is a question that will likely never receive a definitive answer. What can be said is that the transformation, once begun, proved irreversible, and that whatever remained of the man who had once left Byrgenwerth to build a gentler alternative to Willem's obsessions was consumed entirely by the beast that emerged in his place. The aftermath of this transformation created an immediate crisis for the Church's leadership, one that had to be managed with extraordinary care to preserve the institution's public reputation. Officially, the Church's clergy and the wider population of Yharnam were told only that Laurence had passed from illness, a story vague enough to satisfy public curiosity without revealing the true, far stranger circumstances of his fate. Only the choir's innermost circle understood what had actually happened, and they carried that knowledge forward as one of the Church's most closely guarded secrets, a secret that would remain buried for years, resurfacing only when Vicar Amelia's own fate brought Laurence's story back into painful, direct relevance. The leadership of the healing church did not remain vacant for long following Laurence's transformation. The choir, having anticipated this outcome to some degree, had already prepared a succession plan of sorts, trusted senior clergy ready to step into positions of authority and maintain the institution's public continuity without revealing the true circumstances of its founder's disappearance from public life. This transition, executed with the same careful, controlled precision that had characterized so much of the Church's institutional development, ensured that the wider population of Yharnam experienced little visible disruption, even as the organisation's true leadership passed quietly from a transformed founder to a council of scholars who now bore sole responsibility for guiding an institution built on secrets even they didn't fully understand. The knights under Ludwig's command were notably kept almost entirely in the dark regarding the true nature of Laurence's fate, informed only that their founder had passed and that his memory should be honoured accordingly. This exclusion reflects the persistent pattern of information control that had defined the Church's internal culture from its earliest years. a pattern that would eventually contribute to the breakdown of trust between the church's military and religious wings as Yharnam's later crises began to unfold. Ludwig himself, had he known the full truth of what happened to the man who had once been his closest ally within the church's leadership, might have responded very differently to the challenges that would eventually consume his own life and the lives of those under his command. In the years following Laurence's transformation, the district that had once served as the administrative and spiritual heart of the healing church took on a new significance. Known as the Cathedral Ward, this section of Yharnam became the final resting place, in every sense of that phrase, for the remnants of what Laurence had become, and for the deepest secrets the church had accumulated over the course of its existence. The Cathedral Ward's architecture reflected the church's full transformation from a humble medical institution into a sprawling, secretive power centre. Grand structures dominated the district, their scale and ornamentation a testament to how far the church's ambitions had grown since Laurence's earliest hospitals. But beneath this grandeur lurked the same duality that had defined the institution from its earliest days, a public face of healing and reverence, and a hidden reality far darker and stranger. It was here, in the depths of the Cathedral Ward, that Laurence's remains, transformed into something monstrous beyond recognition, came at last to rest, guarded and revered by the church he had founded. The beast that had once been the visionary founder of the healing church became, in this final resting place, both a monument to the institution's achievements and a warning about the costs of its ambitions, though few within the church seemed inclined to read it as the latter. The Cathedral Ward also housed the church's most significant remaining secrets, records of the choir's research, artifacts recovered from the fishing hamlet and from Byrgenwerth's original expeditions, and the accumulated knowledge of decades spent pursuing communion with entities far beyond ordinary human comprehension. This concentration of dangerous knowledge in a single location reflected the church's continued belief, even after Laurence's transformation, that the pursuit of cosmic truth remained worth whatever risks it entailed. For those who came to understand the full scope of what had happened to Laurence, and to the institution he founded, the Cathedral Ward represented something close to a tomb, not merely for its founder's transformed remains, but for the original, well-intentioned vision that had once defined the healing church. The compassionate healer who had left Byrgenwerth specifically to escape the reckless pursuit of forbidden knowledge had, by the time of his death, become exactly the kind of cautionary figure Willem's own eventual fate would come to represent. Two former friends destroyed by remarkably similar ambitions, despite having pursued them through very different institutions. The Cathedral Ward's guardians, clergy and knights alike, maintained a solemn reverence for what lay within its depths, treating Laurence's transformed remains not as evidence of a catastrophic failure, but as a sacred relic connected to the church's ongoing pursuit of transcendence. This reverence would eventually play a direct role in one of the most significant events in Yharnam's final chapter, when Laurence's skull was placed into the care of a devoted vicar who would attempt, in her own way, to complete the transformation Laurence himself had begun. Access to the deepest levels of the Cathedral Ward remained restricted even among the church's own clergy, a physical manifestation of the same information hierarchy Laurence had established decades earlier in the name of safety. Only the most senior clergy, those trusted with the choir's secrets, were permitted into the chambers where Laurence's transformed remains were kept, and even among this select group, the full details of what had happened to their founder remained only partially understood, passed down through carefully worded records that obscured as much as they revealed. The general population of Yharnam, meanwhile, continued to revere the Cathedral Ward as the spiritual heart of their city, largely unaware of the full weight of secrets it contained. They came to its public spaces to pray, to seek healing, to participate in the increasingly elaborate rituals the church had built around blood ministration, never suspecting that beneath their feet, in chambers they would never be permitted to enter, the beast their beloved First Vicar had become lay guarded in reverent secrecy. This gap between public perception and hidden reality, present throughout the entirety of the church's history, reached its most extreme and poignant expression here, in the very heart of the institution Laurence had built. Over the years that followed his transformation, the cathedral ward continued to grow and change, its architecture reflecting the church's evolving ambitions, even as its deepest chambers remained frozen around the secret they guarded. New wings were added, new clergy were trained, new rituals were developed, each one building on the foundation Laurence had laid decades earlier, even as the man himself existed now only as a monstrous presence hidden away from the very institution that continued to celebrate his memory in its public liturgy. The public liturgy surrounding Laurence's memory grew steadily more elaborate as the years passed, transforming the founder from a remembered historical figure into something closer to a venerated saint. Clergy composed hymns in his honour. Chronicles of his life were copied and recopied for new generations of church scholars to study, and his name became inseparable from the church's own identity, invoked in prayers and ceremonies that most ordinary worshippers recited without any awareness of what had actually become of the man they were honouring. This growing mythology served a purpose beyond simple reverence. It reinforced the church's authority by tying it directly to a founding figure whose reputation for compassion and healing remained, on the surface at least, entirely untarnished. Every new clergy member trained under the church's system learned Laurence's story as one of visionary compassion, a healer who had rescued Yharnam from suffering through his discovery and careful application of the old blood's power. The far darker reality, the transformation, the quire secretive ambitions, the exploitation of the fishing Hamlet, remained locked away within the same restricted chambers that housed his monstrous remains, accessible only to those trusted enough to be initiated into the church's deeper secrets. This careful curation of Laurence's public legacy, maintained across generations of clergy who each believed sincerely in the sanitized version of his story they had been taught, illustrates one of the more troubling patterns in the healing church's broader history, an institution built, at least in part, on a foundational myth that grew less true with each passing generation, even as its outward reverence for that myth grew more elaborate and more central to its identity. To understand Laurence fully is to understand the peculiar tragedy at the heart of Yharnam's entire history. A man who began with genuine compassion, who built an institution capable of real, tangible good, and who nonetheless steered that institution gradually and almost imperceptibly toward the exact catastrophe he had once dedicated his life to preventing. The healing church that Laurence left behind was, by any measure, a monument to contradiction. It had healed countless people over the decades of its existence, extending lives and easing suffering in ways that no other institution in Yharnam's history could match. And it had also, through the choir's hidden research and the church's increasingly reckless pursuit of cosmic knowledge, unleashed horrors upon the city it claimed to serve, horrors that would eventually culminate in the very hunt that gives this entire chapter of Yharnam's story its name. Laurence's skull, preserved and eventually entrusted to Vicar Amelia, became a direct thread connecting his transformation to the final catastrophic events that would consume Yharnam. Amelia's own transformation, driven by her devotion to Laurence's memory and her attempt to complete the transcendence he had begun, echoed his fate almost exactly. Another well-intentioned believer consumed by the same ambitions that had claimed the church's founder. In this sense, Laurence's legacy was not confined to the institution he built, but continued to actively shape events long after his own death, reaching forward through decades to claim new victims in his image. The city of Yharnam itself stands as perhaps the most complete expression of Laurence's contradictory legacy. Every hospital, every cathedral, every district shaped by the healing church's influence carries within it both the genuine good the institution accomplished and the seeds of the catastrophe that would eventually consume it. The blood that healed also corrupted. The knowledge that promised transcendence also produced monsters. The compassion that founded the church also, gradually and almost without anyone noticing the shift, curdled into the same reckless hunger for forbidden knowledge that Laurence had once defined himself against. What makes Laurence's story so enduringly compelling, even among the many tragic figures who populate Yharnam's history, is the sincerity of his original intentions. He was not a villain in the traditional sense, not a man who set out to cause harm or accumulate power for its own sake. He was at the very beginning exactly what he appeared to be, a healer who wanted to ease human suffering with the extraordinary discovery his school had made beneath a strange and ancient lake. That such a man could end his life as a beast guarded within a cathedral, his legacy a city consumed by the very horrors he had once sought to prevent, stands as one of the most complete tragedies in the entire history of Yharnam. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Laurence's story is not about the danger of malice, but about the danger of good intentions left unchecked by humility. He never stopped believing he was serving a greater good. He simply lost, somewhere along the way, any sense of the boundaries that had once defined what that good was supposed to look like. And in losing those boundaries, he became, in the end, not so different from the mentor he had once broken away from in search of a better path. Yharnam remembers Laurence in fragments, as the founder of a church that healed thousands, as the architect of secrets that doomed a city, as a skull preserved in reverence within a cathedral he once built with genuine compassion. All of these fragments are true simultaneously, and none of them alone can capture the full weight of what he became or what he cost the city he swore at the very beginning to save. Consider too how many others followed the path Laurence carved out, whether they knew they were following it or not. Ludwig, whose compassion curdled into a transformation nearly as tragic as Laurence's own. Vicar Amelia, whose devotion to Laurence's memory led her to attempt a communion with his remains that ended in the same monstrous outcome. Even Willem, in his own separate pursuit beneath the lake, arrived eventually at a fate that mirrored Laurence's in its essential shape if not its specific details, a brilliant mind consumed by the very truth it had spent a lifetime chasing. Two friends, once inseparable in their shared pursuit of understanding, ended their lives divided by circumstance but united by an almost identical tragedy. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Yharnam's entire catastrophe, the hunt, the plague of beasts, the nightmares that would eventually consume the city's nights, can be traced back not to malice, but to a chain of well-intentioned people who each believed sincerely that they were building towards something worth the risks involved. Laurence believed it. Ludwig believed it. The Schweier's scholars believed it. Even Willem, in his own solitary way, believed it. None of them set out to doom a city. They simply failed, one after another, to recognize the moment when their pursuit of a greater good had quietly become indistinguishable from the very recklessness they had each, in their own way, once sworn to avoid. There is also something worth saying about the ordinary people of Yharnam, the patients, the pilgrims, the shopkeepers and families who lived their entire lives within the shadow of the healing church, without ever knowing the full weight of what lay beneath its cathedrals. They trusted an institution that had, in fairness, given them genuine reason for trust across generations of real, tangible healing. Their faith was not foolish, it was simply incomplete, built on a version of the truth that the Church's leadership, Laurence included, had carefully curated for public consumption, layer after layer of reasonable omission accumulating over decades until the gap between what the city believed and what its leaders actually knew had grown wide enough to swallow an entire civilization whole. It is worth remembering too that Laurence was not present to witness the final consequences of everything he had set in motion. He did not live to see the hunt that would eventually consume Yharnam's knights, did not witness the beast that filled its streets, did not see Vicar Amelia's own transformation, or the desperate hunters who would eventually rise to confront the nightmare his institution had built. In some sense, this absence spared him the full weight of reckoning with what he had done. In another sense, it left that reckoning to fall on everyone who came after him, an entire city inheriting the consequences of choices made by a man who never had to watch those consequences unfold. If you have followed this story from its earliest chapters, from the young scholar arguing with Willem over the ethics of forbidden knowledge, through the founding of a church built on genuine compassion, through the slow, almost invisible drift towards secrecy and ambition, through the ritual that finally consumed him, you have seen something that appears again and again throughout Yharnam's broader history. The particular danger of believing yourself immune to the very mistakes you set out to correct. Laurence spent his whole life defining himself in opposition to Willem's recklessness, and in the end, he became a version of exactly what he had once rejected, transformed not through sudden corruption, but through 1,000 small, defensible choices that each moved him one step further from where he began. It is worth imagining for a moment what might have happened had Laurence chosen differently at any one of the many junctures that shaped his story. Had he maintained closer oversight of the choir, rather than allowing it to grow autonomous within his own institution? Had he refused to authorize continued research into the fishing hamlet once its ethical costs became clear? Had he simply allowed the church to remain smaller, slower, more cautious, content with the genuine good it had already accomplished rather than reaching for a transcendence that was never truly his to claim? None of these alternate choices are certain to have prevented the eventual catastrophe that consumed Yharnam, since so many other forces, Willem's own research chief among them, were already in motion by the time Laurence might have chosen differently. But they remain worth considering, because they remind us that the path Laurence walked was not inevitable. It was chosen, decision by decision, by a man who believed, at every step, that he was still working toward the same good he had set out to achieve as a young student beside a strange and quiet lake. This is, in the end, perhaps the truest lesson Yharnam's history has to offer anyone willing to sit with its full weight. That the most dangerous ambitions are rarely the ones that announce themselves as dangerous from the start. They arrive instead disguised as compassion, as duty, as the simple, reasonable next step in a project already well underway. Laurence never stopped believing he was a healer. That belief, sincere and unwavering until the very end, is precisely what made him capable of building something so extraordinary, and precisely what made him incapable of recognizing the moment it stopped being worth the cost. If there is a single image that captures the whole of Laurence's story, perhaps it is this: a skull, resting in a hidden chamber, once belonging to a man who wanted nothing more than to ease human suffering, now guarded as a relic by an institution that had long since stopped remembering why it existed in the first place. The healer became the myth became the monster, and the city built in his name went on believing for as long as it could that healing was still the point. Let the fog settle now. Let the cathedral bell fade into silence, and let Yharnam's long night close gently around you. Farewell, good hunter.